When I made the video comparing the anime versus the manga for the first season of The Promised Neverland, I praised the anime adaptation for sticking very closely to the original source material. The jailbreak arc, in which the orphans from Gracefield planned their escape to the outside world after finding out a dark secret about their lives, was undoubtedly the best arc of this series, and I was so glad to have seen that nothing major was changed during the anime adaptation to mess it up. The only minor changes that I did notice though were small additions to the narrative that made it even more creepier in the absence of introspective moments to make the tone of the anime more in line with a psychological thriller. So when it was time for me to watch the second season of The Promised Neverland, I was expecting it to once again do what had worked the first time and keep up the momentum it had going for it. But, for whatever reason, the second season of this anime ended up becoming a rushed and simplified version of what happened in the manga. There were just so many creative decisions in the anime that I didn't enjoy, and made me puzzled as to how this series went from being one of the best anime adaptations that I had ever seen thanks to the first season, to then suddenly becoming one of the worst anime adaptations, all because of the second season. So if you want to know what exactly made the second season of the Promised Neverland anime so bad, and also hear my thoughts on the manga and the rest of the story, then stick around to see my thorough analysis of the Promised Neverland Season 2 anime versus the manga. How's it going, anime lovers? My name is David, and I am back to not only shed some light on how the Promised Neverland Season 2 anime compared to the manga, but also share some of my criticisms that I had with both versions, and most importantly, help you guys decide which one you should choose in order to get the best experience out of this series. Since I am covering the second season of this anime, I'm going to assume that most of you by now have already watched the first season. And so, in this video, I will be covering some spoilers from the first season, and also presenting an overview of the entire series from the manga. So, please be aware of this if you haven't watched or read The Promised Neverland yet. There is just so much that I want to say about this second season, since this series is very dear to me. So, let's start this whole thing off by covering the anime first, since it caused quite a stir in the anime community, and for good reason. After watching The Promised Neverland Season 2 and trying to make sense out of every single issue that I had with it, I've come to the conclusion that this whole mess could have been avoided had the anime adaptation just stuck closely to the original source material and not cut out so much content from the manga. The second season of The Promised Neverland's anime adaptation ended up cutting out a little over 110 chapters from the manga, which meant that the anime had to find a way to fill in the huge gaps that it left in the story, and this resulted in the second season falling flat on its face, since the content that was created just for the anime was simply not good enough to fill in the big shoes of the original source material. For example, the majority of changes manga readers would notice if they decided to watch the second season would take place when the children from Gracefield found a shelter after traveling through the forest of the outside world. From what I can tell, manga readers were highly anticipating this season, all because they wanted to see a part in the original story called the Goldie Pond arc come to life. However, the anime decided to cut out everything that was associated with that arc in favor of concentrating only on the journey of the children from Gracefield. Now, while I'm not opposed to this idea, since it honestly would have made the Gracefield escape seem much more special, since these children would have been the only ones to have successfully done it, the anime ended up not doing anything worthwhile with these children to even justify cutting out one of the most exciting story arcs in this entire series. Everything leading up to the Goldie Pond arc in the manga was so anticipated by manga readers because of the important character development moments and exciting battles that came out of it. And what was so frustrating when it came to seeing how the anime would replace all of this cut content was that the anime was never able to live up to the excitement that the manga initially set up. So essentially, what the anime does to replace everything dealing with the Goldie Pond arc was having one episode in which the children from Gracefield were shown trying to survive on their own after settling into the shelter. There could have been so many directions the anime took to make this part seem more exciting, since the children were on their own in an unknown environment full of unknown danger. But somehow, the anime managed to make this one of the most boring parts ever by concentrating on the children discovering a new species of fish that they could possibly eat.
魚？
何者だよ、気持ち悪い。
でもなんか美味しそう。
は？
せーの。
While I will acknowledge that this was a cute and lighthearted moment, since the Promised Neverland in general was unexpectedly a pretty dark and heavy series for being classified in the shonen genre, I cannot in good conscience say that this moment was good enough to replace all the exciting things that originally happened in the manga leading up to the Goldie Pond arc. I will expand more on the Goldie Pond arc later in this video and talk in more detail about why this arc was so good if you didn't know what I'm talking about. But for now, my point that I want to make is that this was just one example out of many that signaled to me that the anime was heading into a direction that would certainly not surpass the quality of the manga. Another set of examples of the anime not being as good as the manga was the way in which it handled the battles and the characters that were absent due to the cut content. So if you guys didn't read the manga, the Goldie Pond arc was also important because it signaled a transition of the series into a battle shonen in which the children would literally have to battle their enemies they met in the outside world, instead of just having a battle of the brains like what happened in the first season of The Promised Neverland. This transition was actually very exciting and intriguing to me, since it introduced new elements into the story that would help raise the stakes, such as arming these innocent children with guns to help them fight, and seeing the tone of the story get even darker with the possibility of even more deaths in the series, while also still keeping in the strategic mind games that made a lot of people fall in love with this series in the first place. However, instead of keeping any of these ideas that made the original story so great and surprising, the anime cut out things such as the idea of these children wielding guns and them facing any real possibility of death, and the battles also ended up being incredibly boring because of how dumb and useless the enemies became in the anime adaptation. One of the best examples I can think of this happening in the anime was when the shelter was being raided by military soldiers.
なんだ。
奥の部屋だ。
In the manga, this scenario took place after the Goldie Pond arc was over, and I was quite surprised to have seen that the anime decided to keep this particular battle in, given that the characters involved in this battle were mainly involved with the Goldie Pond arc. What was even more shocking to me though was how much this battle sucked, because the soldiers couldn't even put up a decent fight against these children. It was totally unbelievable how easily these children were able to fight back and get away from them, when the anime could have at least made it seem like the children were actually in a bit of danger of being killed or getting caught for a little bit to make this battle more exciting. It was as if the anime was afraid of letting any of these children get hurt, and it showed through how incompetent these soldiers were at capturing them, when in the manga, these soldiers actually posed a real threat because they acted like real soldiers who were actually trained for these types of situations. This battle was also one of the most profound moments in the entire series due to certain characters facing the real possibility of death, but the anime wasn't even close to matching the intensity that the manga presented, and thus this battle also became one of the most disappointing parts of the anime. Speaking of boring and disappointing, since the anime cut out so many important characters that were introduced in the manga, the anime tried to make certain plot points make sense by reusing certain characters introduced during this season and also creating their own characters. And one of these original characters happened to be an old demon by the name of Vilk. After the shelter got raided and the children hid in a temple by a demon settlement, this is where the children met the old demon and learned that he had no desire to eat humans. While it was satisfactory for the anime to introduce a character that would inform the children that these types of demons existed in this world, for some reason, the anime kept reusing him for certain scenes throughout the rest of the season, and I personally didn't get why the anime was so infatuated with this character. Sure, there may have been an emotional moment involving him and his family that was one of the more poignant parts of the anime, but I felt like his role should have stopped there, since there's only so much you can do to make that character any more interesting to watch.
必死に生きようとする人間の姿を見て、人間はただの食料ではなく意志を持つものだと、彼らにも命を懸けて守りたいものがあるのだと気づいた。でも食べた。
Speaking of which, this season also struggled with expanding on the history and motivation of characters, which could have helped anime watchers understand and connect with them better. And this was especially the case when it came to characters the anime kept in from the manga, such as Sanju and Mujika. In the manga, these two characters actually had very interesting pasts since they were both connected to the history of the demon monarchy. But unfortunately, because the anime also cut out everything dealing with the political side of demon society, the anime inadvertently cut out the very thing that made these two characters interesting in the first place. And so, the anime never covered these parts of their lives, which didn't help me connect with Sanju and Majika at all, even though they were very important characters for the rest of the series. As I've shown so far, the huge amount of cut content and simplification of certain story arcs resulted in the second season being very boring and overly rushed. But what took this season from being bad enough to one of the worst anime adaptations I'm pretty sure I have ever seen was how this season ended. One of the biggest surprises for me when I got to the final episode was how the anime basically ended mostly the same way the manga did, but instead of leaving it there, the anime does a literal last-minute plot twist by teasing the possibility of going back through the skipped story arcs. I was actually very excited when this moment happened, since The Promised Neverland could get another chance to try and repair its goodwill that it got from the first season. However, instead of leaving the second season off on a cliffhanger, the anime did one of the most insulting things I think I have ever seen in a long time by covering several seasons worth of the story arcs into a montage. Yeah, the anime literally showed a slideshow of the most important moments from the skipped story arcs at the end of the final episode that was never explained afterwards for people to understand what was going on. I really cannot fathom why anyone in their right mind would think that this was a good idea, since this montage didn't benefit the anime-only viewers who will only be confused unless they decided to read the manga afterwards, and this montage will only piss off the manga readers as well, since this meant that we won't be able to see these story arcs come to life through an anime for a very long time, if ever again. This was undoubtedly one of the laziest ways to end an anime, and the montage was really the nail in the coffin for this horrendous anime adaptation. So after watching the second season of The Promised Neverland and reading the entire manga not just once, but twice in order to determine which experience was better, there is no doubt in my mind that the manga was far superior to the anime adaptation in every single way. as I have already talked about earlier, the biggest downfall of the anime was cutting out so much content from the manga and the anime not being able to offset this decision with exciting enough moments to make it worth watching. So if you were left dissatisfied with the anime and were wondering if the manga was worth reading, then by what I've said so far, you could probably guess that I would naturally recommend the manga to any of you who haven't read it yet and want to get the full, unrestricted story. However, I think I would be doing you all a disservice if I also didn't go into more detail as to why you should read the manga, regardless if you watch the anime or not, since I thought The Promised Neverland was one of the best stories I've read in the shonen genre in a long time. Also, before I get into more detail about the story, I want to let you guys know that I'm not covering major plot points that could be spoilers for those of you watching this video who haven't read the manga yet. So, if you noticed that I didn't cover something and you did read the manga, it was probably because it was an important and surprising plot twist of the story that I thought should be discovered on your own terms. What impressed me the most about this series was how it was able to balance the parts of the story that were more logical, such as the strategies during battles and knowledge of real-world subjects, with heartwarming themes such as hope, trust, and forgiveness, and still managed to create an exciting narrative that kept me on the edge of my seat all the way to the end. I personally felt like the anime adaptation during the second season didn't achieve any of these things, and it robbed those of you out there who never read the manga the opportunity to experience the full ride of this amazing adventure. Of course, I've seen a lot of sentiment online about how people were dissatisfied with how the series turned out due to the optimistic progression of its narrative, but to me, I personally didn't see anything wrong with how The Promised Neverland decided to show the lighter side of these types of stories. Just because the series didn't have a single take to the story it was building doesn't mean that it's automatically bad or is any less valuable to read, and I personally believe that The Promised Neverland is a series that does it just right. In the beginning, The Promised Neverland seemed like a dark series since it began with the scary idea of demons eating children who were raised in orphanages that turned out to be farms. However, as the narrative slowly built up its world and showed off the different types of demons and focused in on their society, this series clearly had something more important to say since it presented much more heavier and realistic topics later on, such as the beauty of the circle of life, political corruption, and having empathy for your fellow man. And as much as I get that people thought that this series will continue to be dark after starting off that way, I would argue that the lighter themes presented more prominently later in the story was already planted in the beginning and naturally blossomed into a beautiful flower by the end of it. After the jailbreak arc, which was fully covered by the first season of the anime, The Promised Neverland immediately started world building and even introduced some supernatural elements into the story to help Emma and the other children's nearly impossible goal of freeing all the children in the farms being raised as food. I believe one of the most tragic outcomes of the anime cutting out so much story content from the manga was that a lot of people would never get to experience some of the most exciting moments that happened after the jailbreak arc. And a lot of those moments took place during one of the major story arcs of the series called the Goldie Pond Battle Arc. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about what exactly happened during this arc, since this isn't a spoiler discussion, but what I do want to talk about is how everything leading up to the Goldie Pond arc contributed massively to my love of this series. Another disappointment of the second season of the anime was not only seeing that most of the story arcs were cut out from it, but also that most of the characters introduced during these arcs were cut out as well. And one character that I wish we could have saw come to life through the anime was one of my favorite characters in this entire series, who I will be referring to as Mr. I honestly believe that Mr. was not only one of the best characters in this entire series, but the most important one as well, since he was the first character Emma and the other children met in the outside world that directly challenged them in their convictions about all of them making it to the human world alive. And this character contributed massively to all the children's character developments. Not only that, but Mr. goes through an amazing transformation himself since he began as a distrustful and troubled young man, and also while learning about his real name in the manga was such a great moment to witness, since giving his real name was the perfect way to complete his character development that started all because he met Emma and the other children who changed him into a better person. The children meeting Mr. would then lead them into the Goldie Pond battle arc, which I believed rivaled the quality of the Jailbreak arc, since it featured most of the exciting battles of this entire series and also allowed Emma to further develop by meeting other humans and directly witnessing the stark reality of death after coming to the outside world. This arc was also very important because it was the manga's first step into introducing some of the ruling class demons and giving readers a preview of the intriguing history of humans and demons, which will be explained in more detail later in the story. After the Goldie Pond arc was over, the manga would step away for a bit from its battle-heavy focus so far and introduce the supernatural elements of the story during the Seven Walls arc, which, oddly enough, featured an impressive breadth of knowledge and research of real-world subjects woven into the narrative seamlessly, such as revealing the biology of demons and having a lot of clever mysteries and riddles that honestly fried my brain but still kept me hooked. Next up, the series would finally focus in on the Demon Society and how they actually lived. And this is where I think the Promised Neverland went from a story simply about children wanting to go to the human world to a more complicated yet much needed analysis of why the system of farming children became a double-edged sword for everyone involved by presenting the hierarchy of Demon Society and exploring the corruption of the elite class. Now, as much as I enjoyed learning about what went on behind the scenes of this horrible system of farms, this was also where I noticed the story having a couple of issues, such as this arc reversing an epic moment from the Goldie Pond arc, and one character who was introduced during these events never getting an epic moment to remember them by, like the Promised Neverland has given all the other characters it has introduced into the series. Nevertheless, this arc was extremely interesting to me because this is where the big message of the entire series finally came together and made me realize that the Promised Neverland was truly a phenomenon in the shonen genre because of how well it tied together every loose end and became an awesome tale about hope and forgiveness, which is quite a rare thing to see in stories like these in general. Finally, the conclusion to this series was most certainly the shortest arc and is another hitch in the wheel that could have been a lot more emotional had the series taken its time through inserting more introspective moments to fully digest what happened. But overall, the ending was still satisfying to me and did manage to make me emotional because I couldn't help but reflect on the journey to get here. When I began reading the manga for The Promised Neverland, it was special to me since this manga was not only the reason why my love for anime and manga was revived in the first place, but this series also became the very first manga that I have ever read from the beginning to the end. I believe this story resonated with me so much because it came to me during a time where I was lost after ending my very first YouTube channel that I built for 4 years. But picking up the first volume of this manga and reading it was the best decision ever because this manga has literally changed the direction of my life. Although I'm going to sound a little bit biased and cheesy here, this was exactly the manga I needed to read since it became more than just a good story, but also a very helpful reminder in my life for many things, such as never giving up hope during dark times and not being afraid to ask for help when I really need it. And all the small issues that I did have with it didn't overshadow all of the great moments that I will fondly remember from it for a very long time. So if you were wondering whether the Promised Neverland anime or manga was better, now you know exactly why I believe the manga was better and why I highly recommend it to every single one of you out there watching this video, since this story helped me in so many ways and it could possibly do the same for those of you out there who are interested in this series. So with that said, guys, that is going to be it for me today for The Promised Neverland Season 2 Anime versus the Manga. And before you guys go, if you could do me a huge favor and leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it, then that would be a huge help for my channel and I would really appreciate it. Also, let me know your thoughts about this review in the comments below, or if you watched the anime or the manga of The Promised Neverland. So thank you, anime lovers, for watching this video. Thank you to those of you out there who have been very patient and have been waiting for this video. And I will see you all in the next review.